Welcome back. This is the weekly market view, and I am the part-time trader. Real pleasure to be here with you again on a Friday afternoon. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, we are going to be trying to answer the question that has been on lots of people's minds for what seems like forever now. And that question is Ethereum dead? We're going to be taking a close look at the number 2 cryptocurrency in the market, effectively trying to work out what price action has in store for us over the months and possibly years ahead. Before we dive into that, as I say every single week, just a heads up that none of this is financial advice. Anything that you hear over the next 20 to 30 minutes is purely for entertainment purposes. This is an opportunity for me to share ideas, thoughts on the market from my own perspective. I am not an investment professional, and you should not be making financial or investment decisions off the back of anything you hear on my stream or that you might see over on X through my account at Part-Time Charts. Right, all that being said, let's dive into the world of Ethereum. So look, what I've tried to do in my first few videos is give you a fairly broad overview of the market. We started out in the first week by looking at the macro picture, the yield curve, what I think the yield curve is signaling to us about impending market doom, and the fact that I am starting to see really significant weakness in equity markets, which is likely to pull cryptocurrencies down in a major way. And I've given you all my my top line thesis that I believe we are nearing a historical top in the Nasdaq and the S&P. In fact, not nearing. I believe that top is now behind us. And over the coming months, probably heading into late 2026, early 2027, I believe we're going to see a crash in equities that will, in hindsight, be looked at in the same way that we look at the great financial crisis, the dot-com bubble bust in 2000, and potentially going all the way back to the great financial crisis and the Great Depression, of 1929. So look, I don't think things look pretty or rosy for markets. I think there are reasons to believe that the next couple of years are going to be extremely difficult for anybody trying to make money in markets, and cryptocurrencies, in my view, will not be immune from what we're about to experience. I believe that Bitcoin is heading down significantly, potentially as low as $4,000 to $5,000 by the time this is all said and done. So, unsurprisingly, my view on Ethereum is not great. And you can go back and you can look at any of those videos that I've posted in recent weeks, and you can make your own mind up as to whether any of my analysis carries any weight. But if I'm right and Bitcoin is heading back to 4 to 5K, it stands to reason that Ethereum is also going to suffer significantly in the months ahead of us. And when I look at this chart here, I see reason to believe that we are beginning, we're in the fairly early stages, although it's worth saying we're more than 50% down from the highs that we saw at the back end of 2024, but we are still in the fairly early phases, I would say, of a major significant trend shift for Ethereum, and potentially a downturn that will take it as low as, and hold on to your seat when I say this, but as low as $80, which many people have criticized me for making that prediction in recent weeks. And today I'm going to talk you through why I believe that things look really, really glum for Ethereum. And we'll start with this chart here. I'm going to take you through a few different charts, a few different ways that I like to look at Ethereum. And, you know, one of the most effective ways to analyze price action, I believe, is just looking simply at horizontal support and resistance zones. You know, for all the kind of fancy tools and indicators you can use, for the importance often placed on trend lines, and I myself am not averse to using a trend line every now and again, I still believe that everything pales in comparison to really simple support and resistance zones. And you can see that on this chart here. I mean, I've got 2 really important zones marked out. The first being this base that we began to build in 2024, which we dipped under and then started to hold as resistance. Now, at this point, I will admit, going back to the summer of last year, when we spent so long holding under this SR zone, it was my view at that point that we were going to begin rolling over. And I didn't foresee the final sort of trip up that we made in the markets, where Ethereum pumped by something like 70-80% back into the $4,000 region. But at the time, as that was unfolding, I was warning everybody that this would be short-lived. And while everybody was calling for Ethereum to go to, $10,000-$20,000, setting, really ambitious targets for Ethereum, I was looking at the ETHBTC pair and saying, guys, this is not going to last long. The market will roll over again, and when it does, this time it will be for real. And lo and behold, we are in a position where, if you measure from peak to trough, we've had a drawdown of about 56%, 57% on Ethereum over the first 3 months of this year. So really no time at all we've seen Ethereum get, suffer in a pretty big way in what have proven to be really tough market conditions for crypto. And you can see that this support and resistance zone that I identified last year was again pivotal. Back in February, mid last month, I was pointing out that this looked like a retest. Again, every kind of hint of green in price action was met with calls that Ethereum was bottoming and that Ethereum was finally going to realize its potential, and we would see it boom in a historic alt season that people kept proclaiming was on the horizon. And I was one of the few people here that said, look, we've done nothing but backtest an important zone as resistance. And since then, price has rolled over from about 2,800 by about $1,000 down to 1,800. And I wanted to start with this chart because, like I say, there were two key support and resistance zones. When the first one broke and it was back tested as resistance, we saw a precipitous sell-off in the weeks ahead. And I believe we've just seen similar price action here on this key resistance and support zone. So again, this zone marked out here on the chart all the way back to 2022, a really key level for price that was tested as resistance a number of times before eventually breaking to the upside, holding as support. And here would have been a beautiful long up into this $4,000 region. But price has continued to come back, and this zone has acted like a magnet. And again, early 2025, when price came back to this level and eventually broke through it, I think that is a strong warning signal that tough times are ahead for Ethereum investors. So really simply for me, before we get into any kind of trend lines, any longer term shifts in the market, I just think this is a warning sign, right? The fact that we've broken support, we've held under it now for the best part of a month since early March. And in that time, price has wicked back into that support and resistance zone and has been rejected on every occasion. And recently, I mean, if you just look, if we zoom in on the daily, people were calling this the start of the bottom for Ethereum. And, as I've posted many times before, unless we began to hold above this support and resistance zone and reclaim it, with this looking like a deviation, I saw no reason to be bullish. And in fact, I think if you look at charts that I posted earlier in the week, I was pointing out that this starts to look a little bit like some sort of rising wedge back into a key zone. And lo and behold, what's happened since? Price has fallen out of the rising wedge over the last couple of days, and we are starting to see real weakness in the price of Ethereum. I think we're down by 6.5% today, and my best guess is that this is the start of a much bigger move down. Now, whether that materializes overnight, I couldn't tell you. There's a possibility that we chop around here for a few more weeks, potentially even a bit longer. But one thing I am sure of is that unless we reclaim this zone in the 2,100 area, I cannot see an excuse to be bullish on Ethereum. I can't see any reason why you would want to long this at the moment. And look, people have tried to redraw the chart. I mean, there are some really high profile crypto analysts, some big TA accounts that over the last couple of months have consistently tried to convince themselves and their followers that Ethereum remains bullish. And every time a key support zone has been broken, they've redrawn the lines. This is really clearly a support zone that held throughout all of 2024. And the moment it was broken, the people that were proclaiming we were at support here and were about to boom, they shifted, they started drawing different lines. You saw people that were drawing lines here, calling this the real key support zone, a support and resistance zone. And look, that's fine, you can do that. But even if you do that, price is being rejected here again. You've even had people drawing what I think are really funky lines to try and claim that this is some sort of right-angled broadening wedge and this is a bullish pattern and we're bottoming here and we're going to boom back up into the 4K zone. I'm sorry guys, I don't buy it. And the one thing that I've learned more than anything else in the last few years, since I've really been getting deep into the TA game, is that if you've got a key area like this here in the 2100 zone and price gets above it, breaks to the upside, and then eventually gets below, that is normally a really strong sign. Unless we get back above here, like I say, and this turns out to be some sort of short-term deviation, a trap that lulls people into shorts. Unless that happens, there's absolutely nothing to be bullish about on Ethereum. And I'll skip. I mean, this is the weekly view, right? And let me take you through the monthly view. I've been saying for a long time now, since sort of the latter half of 2024, that this break in the long-term uptrend on Ethereum, which dates back to December 2016, was not a good thing. And price did temporarily rally in November when Bitcoin looked strong, the sort of latter part of last year. But ultimately, all that happened was that we got rejected at this trend line. So again, I talk about the importance of horizontal support and resistance zones. Even if you're a big fan of trend lines, I just can't see how you can see this chart and be bullish. I mean, look, Ethereum made new highs in 2021. Price was trading at about 4 or 5 times the previous all-time high that we saw way back in 2017. But since then, since late 2021, despite the fact that Bitcoin has boomed and has gone to new highs, despite the fact that we've seen some pretty strong gains in other coins like Solana, Ethereum just hasn't got anywhere near delivering the type of return that crypto investors have gotten used to over the last decade. And it's my view that in hindsight, if we zoom out and we look at the 3-month view, I think in hindsight this will simply look like a very straightforward lower high, the first on the higher time frame, and one that sends it down really significantly. And as you can see here, my view is that the downside break is going to take us much, much, much lower than most people can imagine. I'm expecting Bitcoin to fall by about 95% in the coming sort of 18 to 24 months. And I can't see a reason why Ethereum wouldn't at least replicate that move. Now, historically, Ethereum has gone down by more than Bitcoin in bear market, sorry. And I think there's a good chance that we will see the same again. And we'll come on to the ETHBTC chart in a minute. But my thesis is long-term break in the uptrend that has been supporting price for close to 8 years now, just over 8 years. So the best part of a decade, we've seen the price of Ethereum appreciate and bounce off this long-term support, this trendline support. But for the first time in that period, we've broken down, we've backtested, and we're seeing really significant weakness. This is the support and resistance zone that I was talking about on the last chart. I struggle to see. I know people have a lot invested in cryptocurrency and people are very emotionally attached to it as an asset class, probably more so than anything else in the world. But I just struggle to see how, if you know anything about technical analysis, if you know anything about markets, how you could be bullish on this. And then just one last ETHUSD chart, just to top off with before we start looking at the BTC pair. This is a chart that I've been posting for a while on X. It's at Part-Time Charts if you haven't followed me yet. And again, this uptrend, looking at the weekly, going back to the bottom that we saw in the spring summer of 2022, this uptrend has acted as support on multiple occasions, and each time we've moved into this zone, we've seen a pretty significant reaction in terms of price driving to the upside. But when we look back at earlier this year, when price eventually broke through, that to me is a big warning sign that Ethereum is not healthy at the moment. And the combination of the macro trend break on the monthly, the breakdown of the weekly uptrend that dates back to the bottom of the last bear market, and the break of this key support and resistance zone in the 2100 region, to me this just looks disastrous. Honestly, there's no way of sugarcoating it. I think there are so many people that are bullish on cryptocurrencies at the moment, and I keep saying this on X, an entire generation of young men, and that's no exaggeration, there is an entire generation of young men that have been sucked into a space that is fraught with difficulties, fraught with scams, but promises to deliver insane returns in short periods of time. This market has pulled people in like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime. And the emotional investment that people have made into crypto is often far greater than the financial investment they've made, because what's happened is people have stuck their life savings into crypto. They have been glued to the 1 hour chart for, in some cases, years, hoping to replicate the gains that we saw back in 2020 and 2021. But those market conditions are just not around now, guys. If you look back, the money printers were turned on in unprecedented fashion at the bottom of the COVID collapse. And all of the longs were flushed out during this move, which, in the space of a couple of weeks, just brought the cryptocurrency market to its knees and meant that projects like Ethereum were revisiting their bear market lows from the 2018 correction. And what happened was all of that money that flowed into the system, all of the cheap money that we saw flushing around, was used to speculate on financial markets, and particularly young men being sat at home during the COVID pandemic, the COVID lockdowns. It meant that a lot of that money made its way into cryptocurrency, and projects like Ethereum benefited massively. I mean, in the space of a year, you saw something like Ethereum go from $80 to $4,000. I mean, insane returns, 40, 50x delivered for people that invested. And people have been hooked, people that didn't make it out then, or perhaps weren't early enough to capture a lot of those gains. They've been trying desperately to convince themselves that alt season is around the corner, that we're going to see a similar move. And I just think there are too many people that are bullish, too many people that are holders, and a lot of that greed and that optimism has to be flushed out of the market. Now, I've been talking recently about the fear and greed index, which I believe is fundamentally broken. We're supposed to have been in a period of extreme fear in recent weeks. I just don't see that. When you go through some of the most popular accounts on X, all of them are almost universally bullish, and there are only a few people like myself and Max Price and Justin Bennett. There are a small handful of people, North Star Charts, the Great Martis. There are maybe half a dozen of us that are saying, watch out, things look bad. But on the whole, most people are still extremely bullish, and I just can't see how you can justify that given this price action. But the great thing about markets is that, you know, people will continue to be bullish all the way down. People will find a reason to convince themselves that Ethereum is about to go up, right until the moment where actually you're presented with a peak financial opportunity. And that's what we've seen in the past. 2022 bottom was similar. Everybody was bullish all the way down, and at the bottom lots of people capitulated. So look, quite simply for me, I think given the scale of this breakdown, given the fact that we were unable to make new highs despite a pretty healthy cryptocurrency market over the last couple of years, I think there's good reason to believe that we will see Ethereum close the gap on all of this sort of inefficient move to the upside. And at the very least, you know, I've outlined 3 key targets here. At the very least, I expect us to get back into the 300 to 400 region. Potentially, I think we go as low as $80. And honestly, I use the word potentially. I think there's a high likelihood that we are about to see a complete and utter collapse in the crypto markets, and Ethereum is going to be one of those that surprises people. Let's take a look at the ETH-BTC pair. Now, what I find most interesting about ETH-BTC is that I started charting this quite seriously probably mid last year, and in that time, it's been fascinating to watch everybody calling the bottom on ETH-BTC on an almost weekly basis, and you're still seeing it. I find it remarkable. I mean, honestly, ETH-BTC has not made a new high on the weekly chart since December 21. So every time price has rallied, it's made a lower high, lower high, lower high, lower high, lower high, lower high, and now we're starting to see acceleration to the downside, or we have been seeing that for the best part of 7-8 months now. So what I find remarkable is just the optimism among Ethereum investors, the ability for them to blind themselves to the most obvious things that are staring them in the face and continue to convince themselves that now is a unique time to grab Ethereum, that all that capital that has been built up in Bitcoin is likely to rotate, and we're going to see alt season and exponential gains, and Ethereum's going to 10, 20,000. I just haven't seen any evidence for that being the case over the last year. And I recall way back last year, you know, we were at the bottom. I mean, look, people have viewed this different ways, right? People have said that this is like a range. So people have said this here was a range and that we were at the bottom of the range back in early 24, and the rally to the top of the range was imminent. Then the bottom of the range started to break. It looked like maybe we've reclaimed, and people were bullish again here. All the while I was pointing out that this big uptrend, which again goes all the way back to late 2016, had been broken, and that this move here was nothing more than a retest. And right here is the point where I became really, really bearish on the future of ETH-BTC. And since then, you know, price has sold off. We saw people trying to claim that this support line here was part of some sort of right-angled wedge that was going to see price rebound and revisit the top of this wedge. Again, price broke down from that. People were still bullish when we got down here. Key support and resistance zone, price broke down. And the whole time I've been saying people are too quick to call the bottom. This shift here, right, when you talk about a trend line that has held for nearly 10 years, when that trend line breaks to the downside, backtests and gets rejected, I'm not quick to be thinking about buying opportunities, getting back into the market. To me, this is the time to sit tight, to be patient, to let price unfold, and to ultimately let the market take us where it wants to go. I do not want to be standing in the way of a 10-year trend shift in Ethereum priced in Bitcoin. So what we saw latter part of last year was strength in Bitcoin, but Ethereum struggling to make any kind of gains versus the king of crypto. And here we are. I mean, you look back at the 21 top, the last high that we made on the weekly, Ethereum is 75% down versus Bitcoin. And it's remarkable to me, like I keep saying, that during that period, people have been able to convince themselves every single week that Ethereum was on the brink of bouncing back and triggering alt season. It's just not happening. So the sooner people wake up and smell the coffee, face the music, face up to reality, whatever cliche you want to use, the better it is. I learned early doors that people that capitulate and get scared early are often much better off than those that wait and try and brave it out and eventually end up doing the same thing, but just much later on. So for me, what I see here, and this support resistance zone is not quite as clean as some of the others that we've seen in the past, and there are a couple of different ways, but I think we're breaking another key support and resistance zone here. And here's another way of looking at ETHBTC. Again, this big uptrend, broken, back tested. People know how much I love a bump and run bottom. I think we are seeing something like this. And if you look back, I first started painting this pattern in late 24. I've had to redraw it because I accidentally deleted it from the chart. But you can see for months now, I've been saying price has pushed off this key sort of downtrend, and I expect a much bigger move to the downside. Now, I think I've actually been quite optimistic for Ethereum holders with the region that I expect ETHBTC to bottom. Looking at the state of the market, I think there's actually a decent probability that price comes further down than what we're seeing at the moment before starting to bottom and heading up. Regardless, the really simple take I have on Ethereum and ETHBTC in particular is that we're not bottoming. We're not bottoming here. We're not about to see major strength on the ETH-BTC pair. Now, from a technical perspective, if there was one thing that maybe bulls can legitimately claim, it is that we are seeing historic levels of oversold conditions in ETH-BTC at the moment. And it's rare to see, this is the 2-week chart. So the higher the time frame, the more powerful these moves are. It's rare to see such weakness in Ethereum. You can see that we've never even been close to being this oversold. Now the question is, does that mean that strength is imminent and the market is bottoming and this is a historic buying opportunity? Or is this merely indicative of a much more powerful trend shift? And I expect some of this kind of these oversold conditions to be unwound on a fairly short-term basis. So I can imagine us doing something like sort of coming up, maybe a bit more downside and then coming up to reset the oscillators and to unwind some of the oversold conditions that we're seeing before more downside, and potentially painting some sort of big bullish divergence on the 2-week or the monthly before we start to put a real bottom in and maybe accumulate for some time before making a run. Now the good news is I'm not bearish on ETHBTC forever. I actually think this will end up being a really bullish setup. I just don't think we're anywhere near the bottom at the moment. I think you're looking at 12, 18, possibly even 24 months before you will see Ethereum show any meaningful strength versus Bitcoin. And even when it does, bottoming on ETHBTC doesn't necessarily mean bottoming on ETHUSD, and I will keep you posted as to how I see the market unfolding as and when we get there. But bottom line is, I think longer term we're going to see much lower for ETHBTC. However, when the market eventually does turn around, and I'm anticipating late 26, early 27 as being the sort of key timelines, I do think we're going to see ETH showing significant strength versus Bitcoin alongside lots of other cryptocurrencies. So I've talked about how I'm long-term bullish on Ethereum, on AVAX, but I think we're going to go much, much lower in the short term before we get some of those historic buying opportunities. So look, that's just my view. It's possible that I'm wrong in both ways. It's possible that, you know, maybe ETHBTC is bottoming out here, and also that Bitcoin is bottoming out and we're going to see some significant upside. I don't think that's the case looking at what I'm seeing across the rest of risk on markets. It's also possible that I'm right about the downside, but that the upside for ETHBTC never materializes. We will have to look at some of that closer to the time, but certainly for now, I cannot be bullish on Ethereum. And just to wrap up our analysis, I just got a few more charts for you. This it's a bit of a messy chart. I absolutely hate this massive wick that was created by oil going negative during the COVID crisis. But this is Ethereum versus US oil. And as you all know, if you've been following me on X through @PartTimeCharts, and if you've seen any of my other videos that I've posted on YouTube in recent weeks, I'm really bullish on commodities and oil. And I think, you know, I'm thinking about commodities and oil as a way to protect myself and my family during the coming crisis. And ETH versus oil is signaling a major shift in the trend. So ETH has been really powerful for the best part of a decade, consistently putting in higher highs and higher lows versus US oil. But what we've seen is this trend line that has been formed since the December 19 bottom and has held on multiple occasions has now given way. And again, I use these charts just to help me build, I suppose, a macro view on where markets are heading. So if I'm really bullish on oil, and I think oil looks good versus USD versus the S&P 500, then what does oil versus ETH tell me about the strength of the cryptocurrency market? And at the moment, what it's telling me is that things look bad, look really bad. So again, I expect this to accelerate to the downside. I would not be surprised to see, you know, a 90-95% decline in the price of Ethereum relative to US oil, potentially even more, because I think we're going to head down 90 to 95% against US dollar. And I suspect in that time, US oil is going to appreciate versus the dollar. So, you know, as an investor, I'm looking at this, and I know lots of people, like I said earlier, have been really pulled in, sucked into the cryptocurrency markets and see it as potentially their route to quick financial gains, you know, financial freedom. I think it's a shame that people are so close-minded about other opportunities out there, because the way I'm seeing the market at the moment is that the opportunities that there are in commodity stocks, in oil stocks, are just as exciting as anything that we might have seen in recent years with some of these large cap cryptocurrencies. I mean, look, we're not going to get a 50x move in the space of a year on many of these oil and gold and silver stocks that I've been charting, but I think there is upside to be had, major upside, at a time when cryptocurrency is showing weakness, and that's got to make me sit up and pay attention. You know, I just can't see any reason why you would be so glued to cryptocurrency as the only route to gains that you would ignore what a chart like this is telling you. And let's take a look at Ethereum versus a couple of other assets. So again, this is Ethereum versus silver. Similar price action, unsurprisingly. You know, uptrend that has held for a long time was broken, back tested. We got close to back testing it again, and now prices started to roll over. And on the monthly chart, which this is, you are starting to see the first sign of, you know, look, go back to market basics, guys, right? First thing you learn, right? A strong market puts in higher lows and higher highs. A weak market, particularly on the monthly time frame, puts in lower highs and lower lows. You know, this to me is not the sign of a healthy market, and we are heading back into a key support and resistance zone on Ethereum versus the price of silver. As many of you know, unsurprisingly, given my position on commodities, I'm really bullish on silver. I think silver is about to enter a historic period in terms of price appreciation, driven by a decline in the value of the US dollar and other fiat currencies. Although I expect the dollar to be strong versus all the others over the next couple of years, I think fiat is in decline more generally, and that the addiction that governments have to money printing and to borrowing, to unsustainable spending, is about to be unwound in a big way. And if you look back historically, what that means is higher inflation, periods of higher interest rates, and a devaluing of fiat currencies to adjust and reset debt to GDP ratios. And in that context, I expect silver to do really, really well. And unfortunately for cryptocurrency investors, it doesn't look like crypto is going to keep pace. I think this support and resistance zone will give way fairly shortly, and that opens the door to a much bigger move of about 60% down into this region here. I think there's a good chance that might just be the start. I suspect we will end up going much lower, but as a sort of first target, if we begin to break under this support and resistance zone, that would confirm my thesis that ETH is looking really weak, not just versus the dollar, not just versus Bitcoin, but versus other assets like US oil and silver too. Final couple of charts. This is Ethereum versus gold miners. Very similar chart, long-term uptrend break, back tested a couple of times. Now we're revisiting this key support and resistance zone. And I just think if price was really bullish, A, we wouldn't have had a breakdown of this uptrend and a rejection at the back test. And B, we wouldn't be revisiting this support and resistance zone. You know, if there was real momentum, and let's look at this on the 3 monthly basis, right? If there was real momentum in the price of Ethereum, this is really what you would expect to see. You know, we've failed to make a higher high, and we're revisiting this key support and resistance zone on a monthly basis. And I think when it gives way, that opens the floodgates to a much, much bigger move to the downside. And again, if this breaks, for me, that would be further compliments to support my assessment that Ethereum is heading way back to prices that we haven't seen for many, many years. Right, so things are not looking good for Ethereum, and I will wrap up just with this chart, which is the Solana Ethereum chart. The reason why I wanted to end on this is sometimes I make these price predictions on X. Recently, I've been saying I expect Solana to head back to between $1 and $5. Most people have called me completely bonkers for making that call. But if you look at that chart in isolation, it's easy for me to understand why somebody would go, you're mad. You know, you're projecting a 95, 96% decline for Ethereum. But you have to look at the whole, right? So if my thesis is NASDAQ, S&P 500 topping out in a major way, historic high, likely to see major declines, potentially of about 70% in the NASDAQ, and Bitcoin is going to follow. Ethereum is going to get hit harder than Bitcoin. And then I look at a chart like this and I see that this is potentially a major top on Solana versus Ethereum. So ask yourself this, right? If BTC is going to decline massively and Ethereum is going to underperform BTC and Solana is going to underperform Ethereum, how bad could it get? You know, if I'm right and we're about to see a drawdown in Bitcoin into the $4,000 to $5,000 region, where the hell will the price of Solana be by the time that's all said and done? You know, this to me looks like the start of some sort of rising wedge. And in fairness, when we broke back under, I thought this was the sort of throw over that would confirm more downside. I did expect us to break down more quickly than we have done. We got obviously the Trump pump on Solana back in January, where Trump coin and Melania coin were announced and everybody flooded into the Solana chain. But even that turned out to be a short-lived move to the upside. And Solana just looks like, to me, it's struggling to gain any sort of traction versus Ethereum. And again, 2 weekly chart, we've started to see big bearish divergences on the RSI that remind me of what we saw at the top of the 2020-2021 bull market. So if I'm right and we're now back testing the underside of this wedge, I expect price to deteriorate over many, many months, potentially taking us down by sort of 60, 70, 80% versus Ethereum. Now, in that scenario, Solana is going to get blown apart in US dollar terms. Obviously I might be wrong. Maybe this is a longer term SR flip and maybe price is being reset here. We're consolidating above this SR flip and maybe there's major upside. If we break back above this wedge and hold there on the sort of 2 weekly, monthly chart, then I will reconsider my position. But given my view on the rest of the market, I can't see why Solana would outperform Ethereum. And if you look back at some of my videos from the last few weeks, you'll see there were all sorts of reasons to be bearish on Solana, on the USD pair, on the Bitcoin pair, on the gold pair. I struggle to see a world in which Solana or Ethereum do well over the coming months. So look, that's my view on Ethereum. Major downside ahead. And the really worrying thing, if you're a crypto investor, is that Ethereum is normally the second strongest cryptocurrency in the market. So normally when Bitcoin gets hit hard, Ethereum gets hit a bit harder, but some of your smaller cap alts get absolutely obliterated. And if I'm right, and Bitcoin and Ethereum are going to decline by about 95%, then boy, oh boy, Solana investors, AVAX investors, anybody sitting in any kind of altcoin, Doge, you're in for a rough ride. That's it from me for this week. I will be back on Friday next week to bring you another weekly market view. Certainly welcome any feedback on the videos, any requests for charts that you'd like me to see. I will go back to doing a slightly broader overview of market conditions next week, but this week I thought it'd be fun just to really drill in to Ethereum and take a deeper look at where we are. And I suppose I'll just leave you with this chart and just a reminder that unless we reclaim this 2100 area, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't. Have a fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you for being with me. Please do smash the subscribe button if you have found any of my analysis useful, or even if you just want to come back in a year's time and gloat that I was dramatically wrong. I don't think that will be the case, but I will certainly take your subscription and look forward to seeing you in the months and years ahead. Thanks very much, everybody. Great to spend a bit of time with you, and I will see you soon. Take care.